Hi everyone, my name is Louise and this is my Life Through series. I initially created this series so I could start sharing information that I believe would help people through difficult times, hence the name, the Life Through series. I have shared some previous videos with some topics that I have covered, but I've decided to change the approach a little bit. So you can see now I'm sharing a presentation that I'll be looking at, and the idea here is about more sharing my integrated learning. So rather sharing the academics that I've come across while I'll still be doing that, I want to add a different layer, which is more how I've integrated this into my life, and I'll talk through that as I go through the presentation. So I hope you enjoy. Please forgive any mistakes. I don't know how to edit. Okay, so integrated learning is an approach where I can bring together prior knowledge and experience to support new knowledge and experience. We are all going through life. We're all growing through our different experiences, whether they be good or bad. And it's maybe less important for us to talk about what theory is right as much as it is to talk about the experience. And that's integrated learning. It goes beyond the mental plane and it's actually fully embodied. So today, what I'm planning to take you through is the integrated learning for healing from trauma. So it's a story about the nervous system and the body. This topic is super, super important to me. Even if you look at some of the previous videos I made, it was about trying to calm the body under overwhelm. And the reason for this is because out of all the learnings that I've done, trying to heal from trauma, the last learning that I had to do was through the body. And it has been the most powerful experience in trying to heal some of the trauma, but more in trying to be who I want to be as a person, because that's the goal. Isn't that the dream? So, sorry, I'm going to look here, but you shouldn't see me too much. So what is trauma? So trauma is a deeply distressing and disturbing experience. This much we know, right? You don't need to be told what trauma is. We know when we feel traumatized. We know that we feel distressed. We know that we feel overwhelmed. That we feel disturbed. That we're not in our normal way of being. That's when something traumatic happens. This can take many forms. So on an individual level, it can be domestic or family violence or even dating violence, sexual or physical abuse, a serious accident, or a caregiver neglect or verbal abuse. That is, and a lot of people like to diminish verbal abuse, but you'd be surprised around the statistics of how traumatic that is on a young child, especially when coming from a primary caregiver, how traumatizing that can be for a child. Then we move to the other side, which is more about, like, let's call it collective trauma. So community violence, shooting, mugging, burglary, assault, or bullying. Natural disasters such as a hurricane, a flood, a fire, or an earthquake. Also a pandemic. War or political violence, civil war, terrorism, or being a refugee. And the reason I just want to pause here maybe for a minute is because even if nothing has happened to you on an individual level, even within our country of South Africa, there's been a lot of traumatizing events, things that have changed. And I've put that down at the bottom, which is PASS, which is a term that actually stands for post-apocalyptic stress syndrome. And this is something that's been spoken about that happens to either after a war, a plague, colonization, invasion, any of these things. They go and actually look at the stress of the community who had their entire life tossed upside down. Because an apocalypse isn't something that ends, apocalypse is a changing. So when everybody goes through a huge change, they're actually going through a huge trauma because we're not used to adapting to that severity. So that's just in a nutshell, just in case if you weren't sure what trauma was or if you were suffering from it. So this is my little bit of opinion. I know some other people sharing it as well. It's called the healing crisis. So we find ourselves at a time in history where we're at the end of a long lineage of trauma, while learning more and more about its effects and cures. So if you look at how rapidly we're developing as a society, even if you look at the technology, we always speak about if the human beings are able to keep up with the rapid linear timeline that we're on, which is just throwing more information at us. And what's actually happening is we are rapidly discovering, because we're able to have better technology to start learning about the body and the brain and all interactions, we're getting some amazing science and research out about the effects of trauma and the potential ways of working through it. But the irony is we're learning about it so fast that it's actually not coming into regular community and households. And there seems to be this great sort of divide between the knowing of what to do and the actualization of doing what we need to do. And I just put this little fun fact in there for you. So PTSD, which is something that we all commonly refer to, we understand the impacts, and I believe most people acknowledge the existence of PTSD. It was only recognized in 1980. That's very, very, very recent. It's only 4 years older than me. So that should give you an idea. So this alone should give you an idea of how much we're busy learning if PTSD was only discovered or recognized, not discovered, but recognized in 1980, how much more we've actually learned. And if you go on to TikTok as an example, and you let the algorithm figure you out, you're going to get bombarded with information about how all these lovely American kids have all been diagnosed with all these sort of side effects of trauma, which is very good that we know that. But even if you watch these videos, you'll see that people are struggling to integrate that knowledge. They're more projecting that this is now what they know, so it's very much in the mental realm, but they haven't quite integrated on what to do with it. And that's one of the biggest problems, is we're starting to learn, so we're able to understand it mentally, but we're not learning on how to embody it, either as an individual or community. Okay. So consciously or subconsciously, we've all been taught how to handle trauma or someone else's trauma. We tend to have inappropriate reactions to people's trauma for a variety of different reasons. And we won't go into that today. But these are the sort of common tendencies that I see when people are talking about trauma. One of the tendencies is a tendency to diminish the trauma. So the example being is that doesn't sound so bad, it could have been worse. So this could be where a parent maybe neglected you when you were younger, or a caregiver, or you were verbally abused. People say, oh, don't worry about it, it's just, it's just words, it doesn't matter. It could be worse, it could have beaten you. Even though statistically, if you look at the data that's out there, the suicide rate for verbal abuse is actually higher than that of physical abuse. So that statement doesn't actually stand to diminish something just because we think it's not that bad. So everybody has troubles, and other people have it harder. So actually comparing traumas is never a good idea. Everybody is a unique person and they get to react to their traumas in their own way. Nobody gets to judge the size of their trauma, and nor do they have to justify the size of their trauma. Then we have this tendency just to move forward, forget about it, move on. So if you haven't heard of HTFU, it's hot in the fuck up. I belong to that club for most of my life. People have known me as highly independent, very mature. Nothing gets me down because I hardened the fuck up. But really there was an overcompensation. So there is a tendency with most people in society, either where they want you just to carry on and pretend like nothing happened, or you yourself get triggered into a sort of flight scenario where all you want to do is just get away from it. So you tend to move on. And then you either have thoughts or people saying to you, pick yourself up and just move on, just let it go. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and mind over matter. Whatever kills you does. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger is one of the worst things. Because yes, you become stronger if it doesn't kill you, but the other option of that is it kills you. So not the best saying in the world that we have for each other. And then we have this huge thing in society about weakness, and we can go on about it, but there isn't a huge tolerance about it. So we tend to hear crying about it won't make it better. Which ironically, as we go through this, you'll find that crying does actually make it better. Aren't you over it yet? So people will always look, if it's childhood trauma and you're an adult now, they're like, come now, it's been enough time. You're just doing this for attention, or sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt me. That is also a lie. So these are all the things that kind of rattle around even in people's voices that come out when they speak to us about trauma, or rattle around in your brain when you think about trauma. Okay, so how we think about trauma. What I love about this is we think about trauma. So we think we're doing pretty damn well. So when we're thinking about trauma, it's very much within the mental realm. So you hear me talking about the mental realm. So this means within the conscious sort of part of your brain. And just to get you in the right frame of mind, think about this. So we put a lot of importance on our experience of this existence, so what we call the conscious brain, which is also impacted by the subconscious and the unconscious. Unconscious is the stuff that is keeping you alive. So when you're not thinking about breathing, you breathe. Your organs are still going, fantastic. Subconscious is more things that affect us that we're not necessarily conscious of, but the unconscious side, that side of the brain is actually quite large, and it's primarily dedicated to the body. And just to make that point, think about this. Your body knows where every organ is, and it knows exactly how it's doing, and it will never tell you. It makes you go to someone else to get a machine to look at you and to tell you how you're doing. Your brain is an asshole. It won't tell you how you're doing. But we'll also get into potentially why you're not hearing the brain, or why you're not hearing the body, why the brain can't hear the body. But we have this very conscious part that seems to take over when we've experienced something traumatic. And it starts instructing us. Like you can actually hear the voices in you say, I must just change. You know, I must just change, just not be like this anymore. Okay, we'll do that. Let's just get over it. Okay, we'll just do that. It doesn't impact me anymore. I love that one. I must just be more disciplined. Because in our society, like I said, it's mind over matter. The mind is meant to be telling everything that is the individual what's meant to be going on. So if you want to, let's say, for example, be less reactive or sensitive around someone or in a situation, you know, you put the emphasis on yourself and you say, I must be better. I must do better. I'm going to control myself, which are all good ideas and good goals, but thinking that you just have to do it, as in you have to have the willpower to do it, is not enough. Any change that you want to make is going to have to go into the other realms. So when I'm speaking about the mental realm, then we get the emotional realm, then we get the body realm. So if we're being kind to ourselves and we're thinking in the emotional realm, rather than when you think to yourself, so if the scenario is, I want to be less reactive around my boss. Don't know where that example comes from. Rather than thinking, well, you know, I'm just going to squeeze my hand or sit on my hand and I'm going to do this and I'm going to discipline myself and I'll put the elastic band and I'll clip it whenever I'm getting angry or something, or I want to act out. If I was being kind to myself in that situation, I would actually say, how do I feel in those situations? So rather than trying to control myself, I would say, how am I feeling emotionally? Then I would start to realize that I'm actually feeling anxious every time I speak to my boss. So maybe that's where the lack of control is coming from. So the question isn't how I control myself. The question is, why am I feeling this way when I'm around them? And how can I rather better manage that than to control myself? So let's just go to the emotional layer if we were starting to talk to ourselves a little bit better about trauma and not just keep it in the mental realm. And then how we don't think about trauma, which is, what am I feeling in my body? When was the last time you were having a really, really shitty day or a really, really shitty interaction? You thought, whoa, let me stop the voices in my head. Let me stop the panic in my heart. What does my body feel? You never do that. And that's where we go drastically wrong when we're trying to change our behavior or be better in some way, is our body is actually an integral part of that. We are in our body. What I love about this little picture that I got together, you can always see the hierarchy of importance that we put for ourselves. First, we put the brain, then we put the feelings, and maybe way down at the bottom, we put the body. Even though the feelings and the brain are in the body, it's somehow a lesser thing. So we don't tend to think about the body. Now I'm going to go into the next slides and actually tell you about why trauma is happening in the body first and not in the brain first, like our brain likes to think it is. So when trauma happens, so whether it's you are watching some violence happen, domestic violence, because you're watching it unfold in front of you, then you're having the physical potential trauma where someone is touching you, so they physically hurt you, or where someone is verbally directing their aggression and anger towards you, so then you have the emotional abuse. Each three of those scenarios, it's actually hitting your body first. Your body is aware of all of those things before anything else is. It has already picked up the heightened tension in the room. It's already geared you up. And even if the person hasn't touched you, even if you're just witnessing this, or it's just being directed at you verbally, it doesn't have to physically touch you. It's coming in through the senses. So it's actually happening to the body first. Then your body is having such a negative reaction, then your emotions have to come in. And then you start to feel fear, you start to feel doubt, you start to feel whatever you're feeling, an emotion. Then your brain kicks in and goes, well, shit, this is traumatic. I must probably remember this so we don't do it again. Or we don't put ourselves in the situation again. So the hierarchy of actually feeling the trauma first is body, emotion, and then memory. Memory is what we like to think of ourselves as conscious being. And then it's always around that memory that we then write a story. Sometimes for a traumatic event, you don't actually have the full memory, but the chances are your body does, because it is what actually anticipated and felt it first. There is in the polyvagal theory, they talk about neuroception. So when they talk about the brain, and they talk about my perception of this, so that's the brain talking. But then they talk about neuroception, where the body is actually perceiving something before the brain and everything else does. So when these types of events happen, and because we have such a, I want to say a weak understanding about the impact of trauma, something very natural happens in the body. It starts keeping the score. And because your body is the most primitive and largest part of everything, I mean, we're in our body, but the biggest part of our brain is also dedicated to making the body run, is it's unconsciously keeping all these records of what's actually happening to us. This is a very primitive sort of function of our brain, which is the biggest part of our brain, in order to keep us alive. I mean, we're an animal. Our main primal instinct is to keep alive. So when there is something traumatic, it deeply embeds in the mind, and therefore it's deeply embedded within the body. Then what happens? Now, because the body has all these scores and it's so overwhelming, and it can't go out day to day feeling this way and feeling this vulnerable. So your brain your subconscious brain starts saying, you know what? I can't handle all this stress and this information that the body is giving. So I'm actually just going to cut it off. We're no longer talking. So then your heart and your emotions can go on for a little while. They can be very happy and carefree and everything's wonderful. But there is this sort of shadow and demon kind of growing in the background, which is there's trauma within the body that hasn't been addressed because the mind is either unwilling or the heart is too overwhelmed to deal with the emotions. So just a solid disconnect happens. And where I was saying that sometimes you won't feel pain, this is actually why you don't feel pain when it comes to certain traumatic experiences, because this means that this wall has become very thick and you're not actually having feedback from your body. Now, there's a lot of consequences to this disconnect. One, your body can't tell you what's going on, can't tell you that it's deregulated. And because it's being ignored, it's just being pushed into more and more situations. So when people go through a traumatic event and it's not dealt with in a way that helps the person feel capable and secure, where they felt like they had the ability to create freedom from that traumatic event, they remained trapped in that traumatic event, and it remains trapped within the body until it has an opportunity to be released or dealt with. And it's not that time heals all wounds, it's that time will just hide all wounds until you're ready to deal with them, and you heal them and you take them out and you work with them. But so what happens is there's this huge disconnect between the body, your emotions, and your brain. But that's not true. Because the body is now hypervigilant. So this is seen in, like me, I'm the person who, when I get into a room, I want to go sit at the chair that's facing the wall so I can see and scan the entire room. It's called hypervigilance. I used to think that was a personality trait. Now it just turns out it's a trauma response, and it's also something my body was pushing me to do because it knew that I needed to be hyper aware. It had experienced bad things, it didn't want it to happen again. So when I get into large crowds, it says hyper aware, and then I have no choice. So then that happens, and then now because I'm hyper aware, I'm able to pick up on things, and these things can either trigger me or they can't. But because my body is now picking up on it, I just suddenly have an emotion or a thought that makes no sense and is irrational, and I'm sent off into a downward spiral. Aggression, anger, overwhelmment, sadness, so many options. And there's a sense of irritation because you don't know where it's coming from. You don't know where it's coming from because you've cut off communication from the body that is actually telling us where it's coming from. Our body is picking up something. But because we've never ever gone into the body to see how to regulate this, we have what's called deregulated nervous system. It's amazing. So this is what happens when there's a prolonged exposure to trauma with no real release, is the nervous system becomes, what I was talking about with the hypervigilance, the nervous system becomes overactivated into a certain state, and it doesn't know how to regulate back. And if the longer that you go on not knowing how to regulate it, the more deregulated you are, so the more likely you are to get more traumatized as you go along. So if you're super lucky and have trauma throughout your life, you don't just have PTSD, you have complex PTSD. But that's another thing to Google. So what is actually happening in the body when we have this whole radar system going off and a disconnection between the heart and the brain? Then we have none of this balance. So ideally, the place that we want to be in order to be effective human beings, like just from your brain functionality, your body functionality, and optimal life functionality, your body has to be in a parasympathetic state, which is a rest and digest. So it means you're able to recoup when you do rest, and you are able to gain nutrients throughout the day. And a lot of people think that resting is just lying down, but actually sort of restorative rest is a genuine relaxation and letting go of the situation around you. But people who've been experienced trauma and deregulated nervous system don't even know what that feels like, so don't know that they're aiming for it. The other side of that coin, so the state that people with a deregulated nervous system are constantly surviving in, is the sympathetic nervous system. So this is where you're sitting in the flight, fight, or freeze. Flight is quite an obvious one. So this is when you're constantly feeling panic, like you need to flee, like you just need to get out of here, like I just need to run. And that doesn't always happen when you're outside in the real world, when you see a situation you don't want to be in. This can be literally while you're sitting on, on the couch and just going, I want to fucking go. Fight. So this is the fun one. So if you have a lot of rage and anger, everybody's an enemy, and I must toughen up. So this constant sense of war, the separation of self from other, because you want to fight. So this means that a lot of people are your enemy. The outside world is your enemy. Everybody is against you, and you're prepping yourself constantly to be in a fight. And this can be literally switched on and off quite easily. Freezing. So this is when your sympathetic nervous system is just like no more, and it just feels hopelessness. It feels depression and it feels overwhelmed. And this is when you just go into the nothing state. And again, just because you go into the nothing state doesn't mean you're resting very well, because there's usually a lot of mental things going on, and that's that alignment between, if we can understand what's going on with the body, maybe you can reverse engineer and then understand that other shit that's going on. So when you are in a free state and you are depressed and you have a lot of self-talk that's negative, and you have a lot of self-talk that's just saying this is the end, there's nothing, there's no purpose, there's nothing, that is a complete disconnection from life. You've completely disconnected from not only your own body, but your own life, your own existence. So that's what happens. And what you want to do within this journey and this integrated learning, and that's what I'll take in the next video, is how to actually find that balance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So what does a deregulated nervous system look like? So adults who experience early trauma are prone to deregulation of the brain and the nervous system, especially in response to stress. Deregulation in turn can trigger depression, anxiety, illness, addiction, and emotional outbursts. So you'll see that in the form of rage. I did find a new acronym, HSP, highly sensitive person. Who knew? Sleeping problems, daily fatigue. There's nothing worse than having insomnia and feeling tired the entire day. Chronic pain and inflammation. I read a fascinating article about how anger can cause inflammation. Irritability and overwhelmed, and then concentration problems. Imagine concentration problems were actually caused by the body and not just being lazy or not being focused. Imagine if there was more to it than just that. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Okay, so we're coming to the end of my video. So the invitation that I will leave you with is don't assume you are the failing. If any of this resonated with you and you feel like you are in these spaces, don't assume that you are the problem. Assume that there is just something in you that needs to be resolved. Start being curious about the possible impacts on your life and health. So if any of this resonated with you, start being curious as to, well, if this is something that is a side effect of something else, how might it be impacting me? And start seeking treatments that resonate with you. So you can find a practice that connects you with your bodies, exercise, yoga, running, breathing, meditation. There's gazillions out there. Or you can get professional assistance. So EMDR is a good light therapy for PTSD and complex PTSD. TRE is something I'm busy experimenting with. I'll talk to you about that soon. Called trauma release exercise. It's super fun. And then coaching, which is something that I do offer. And then therapy is always a good option. So in our next learnings, I do want to take you through what I have been learning through the TRE process, which is also enlightened a lot about the polyvagal theory, which goes into that sympathetic nervous system that I was talking about, and then a book that's called The Body Keeps the Score. So I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I hope to speak to all of you soon. Please note that if you do want to reach out to me, there is my email address, and the website is coming soon. Please let me know if you have any questions, and we'll chat soon.